I can't believe we haven't already discussed this as part of our inflammation series because it is one of the best examples of inflammation occurring to us in our female bodies on a very monthly, very regular basis. Welcome back to Wellness Fixes the Pod. I'm your host, Dr. Kelsey Vick, a board-certified orthopedic doctor of physical therapy, a pelvic floor physical therapist, and the owner and founder of the Ella Wellness Sisterhood. And this will be part 3 of our inflammation series. In episodes 1 and 2, we covered the basics of inflammation. And then in the second episode, the second part of the series, we covered what local inflammation looks like at various tissue types. So skeletal muscle tissue, smooth muscle tissue, and our skin. So make sure you go and check out those episodes. We will cover a brief rundown of some of the components today, but if you're looking for a deeper dive, check out those. So it is the week after American Thanksgiving as well. So I want to say I hope you guys had a wonderful Thanksgiving with friends, family, your loved ones. I am very grateful for you. Gratitude was our last episode, so it was a tearful episode for me, but also I just wanted to reiterate how grateful I am for you guys for listening to this podcast and hoping that you're gaining something from this and learning something from this as we just cover sort of all parts of the body, right? And especially in these debunking series where we debunked cortisol and now we're debunking inflammation, showing how inflammation is not all bad, showing how cortisol is not all bad. So I hope you guys are enjoying these. I'm enjoying sharing these episodes and this knowledge with you and this education with you. So just thank you so much for being invested in your own health and then for also supporting my podcast and just all of the content and all of the education that I'm putting out there. So thank you. So to get into it today, one of the best examples of our inflammatory cycles happening within our bodies is the menstrual cycle. And I can't believe we haven't covered this yet because my whole goal for this series is to decrease the negative connotation and the negative viewpoints surrounding inflammation. And I know we can have positives and negatives with our menstrual cycle, right? Especially up and down throughout our cycle. Sometimes we're not feeling as great. Sometimes we feel a little bit more bloated, a little bit more cranky, but sometimes we're feeling great. Sometimes we're in the prime spot to be able to build muscle, to recover. Our nervous system's able to adapt in a good way. So there are some good things. And honestly, our menstrual cycle is one of the primary indicators for how our overall health and wellness is going as a female. They call it in PT school and maybe elsewhere, but they called it the fifth vital sign for women because if you have a very regular, I'm not going to say normal because normal can span, but a very regular menstrual cycle with the expected sort of trajectory, it's one of the primary ways to realize like, okay, my body's doing really well in its hormonal regulation, in its nervous system regulation, and all of the processes that go on throughout the body throughout our cycles. So it's very important, but it is also one of the primary examples of inflammation within our own body and the inflammatory process within our own body. So from a broad overview, we have a stimulus, and this is just inflammation as a whole, right? We have a stimulus, help signals are sent out. We have immune cells that arrive to the area. We have our little brother neutrophils, our big sister macrophages, and our middle sister lymphocytes. And again, refer back to the first part of this series if you are unfamiliar with those terms, because we sort of dive into inflammation in the term of a sibling dynamic that gets super fun. But then we shift from that pro-inflammatory state when all of those immune cells are starting to clean up, starting to sort of mark invaders, attack invaders. We start to move from that pro-inflammatory state to that anti-inflammatory state, which is where healing occurs, and then that repair and regeneration can happen. So if we look at this process over the menstrual cycle, we can see how similar they are, right? So the menstrual cycle and inflammation. Inflammation is necessary in order for a natural menstrual cycle to occur. If we think about what's actually happening during our period, it's a shedding of a lining, right? So I hate using this term, but it's the thing that's sticking with me a little bit. But the inflammatory process is all about healing and rebuilding up, right? And so that happens to our endometrial and our uterine lining month after month after month, right? And so when we shed, we're sort of getting rid of some of that debris, some of that, again, I hate using that word because it's not debris, but if we look at the inflammatory process as a whole, menstruation and our menstrual cycle is the perfect example because yes, we get rid of that lining and then we're working on building it back up through that inflammatory process in order to have it happen again in order to support a healthy pregnancy, whatever our goals are. So we can see how the menstrual cycle is the perfect example for the inflammatory process. So next we'll dive into a few of the phases of the menstrual cycle and what's actually happening in each and how it relates back to the inflammatory process. But then at the end, we'll also talk about how that local inflammation happening within our reproductive system, right, that we covered last time, can also affect our systemic inflammation that we feel overall. So that's swelling within the body, muscle crampy, digestive issues, things like that. So it'll sort of ease us into our last and final part of the series that we'll cover next week about systemic inflammation. But for now, we'll work on that transition, and I really feel like chatting about the menstrual cycle and the inflammatory process can help just give a better example and a more in-depth example. And something cool for us to think about throughout our own menstrual cycles is what's happening to our bodies from an inflammatory standpoint. So we'll start at day 1, so menstruation or our period. A stimulus for the inflammatory process to start is that drop in our hormones. So that drop in progesterone and estrogen cues that shedding of that endometrial lining. But before that happens, there's a lot of processes that have to take place that are a part of the inflammatory process. So the stimulus is that hormonal drop of progesterone and estrogen. Ooh, those are hard to say back to back, but the response is that endometrial lining shedding. So the endometrial lining releases prostaglandins, which help to cue the muscle contractions of our uterus in order to help shed that lining. The contractions themselves create local inflammation, as muscle contractions do, right? Just like in skeletal muscle, in order to help sort of push out and get rid of that lining in order to build back up a new one. Those prostaglandins that are released create what we call also a hypoxic environment. So an environment that lacks oxygen, which anytime our body lacks oxygen, that's a cue for stress. So that itself also cues the inflammatory process. So the immune cells and enzymes are activated after this, and they help clean up the area after shedding, and they promote inflammation within the area to help clear the lining as well. So this is where period symptoms can come from. So those elevated prostaglandins can again, they help with the muscle contractions, but because of that, that's sometimes where we get some of that cramping, where we get some of that bloating, where we get some of that fatigue. Our body's working really, really hard. We also have what we call MMP enzymes that help to break up the extracellular matrix of that lining to help our bodies clear it that much quicker and that much better. And excessive MMP enzyme activity is associated with heavier and more painful periods. So those prostaglandins and that enzyme activity, part of the inflammatory process, are part of the contributors to some of the symptoms that we have during our periods. And not to say that this, again, I know we don't like to have those symptoms, we like to not have those symptoms, but my hope is that now knowing what contributes to them, it can help you realize and give yourself and give your body a little bit of grace during that time to say, oh, my body's doing exactly what it should be doing. It's releasing those prostaglandins, it's releasing those enzymes in order to help my body to build back up that lining again and to basically heal in that way, right? So that's the menstrual phase or the period phase. So that's in the first few days of our menstrual cycle. Then we move on to the follicular phase. And in the follicular phase, estrogen levels start to rise, which has anti-inflammatory properties. So this is the phase where we feel really, really good. Our body heals really, really well. We recover really well. We build muscle really well. Our nervous system can switch between sympathetic and parasympathetic really, really well. And this is the phase associated with more of that anti-inflammatory properties because of that rise in estrogen. Then comes ovulation. So hormones LH and FSH are released in order to cue a new egg to be released from a follicle, which this can cause a little bit of local inflammation in response to that hormonal release, so people might have some of that pain, some of that bloating, some of that discomfort around that ovulation time because of this local inflammation response to the hormone release in order to help that egg release and go through the cycle. And then after this comes the luteal phase. So this is where we start to have a rise in progesterone. And progesterone itself actually has both inflammatory, pro-inflammatory, and anti-inflammatory properties. And it just kind of depends on how our bodies are structured and built in our environment around us as to which one sort of dominates. So we have to have the right balance with estrogen in order for progesterone to have its anti-inflammatory properties. If our overall immune status is weakened, that's when progesterone might have those pro-inflammatory properties. It also depends on the receptor type and then the tissue type that progesterone is acting on. So a lot of different factors go into that, but in general, that luteal phase is as progesterone rises, and that can cue both inflammatory, which is what we might feel more of, and anti-inflammatory properties. So that all happens, that's the whole menstrual cycle and inflammation at a local tissue-specific reproductive organ level, right? But how does this feed into our bodies systemically? Because I know a lot of us feel super cranky, super fatigued, super bloated, very moody, all of that throughout this process. So we know that that process isn't just going on locally, right? It's a full body process. So this is where we weave and transition into more of systemic inflammation. So we covered initially the inflammatory process. We covered what happens at a local level. Now we're going to transition into what happens to our bodies systemically from a broader range, because we know that hormones act throughout the body, neurotransmitters act throughout the body. There's so many things that send messages and communicate throughout the body. So that can be a contributor to some of the symptoms that we have during our overall menstrual cycle throughout our body. So we have a blood test that we can do to test systemic inflammation, and it tests the amount of C-reactive protein within our bodies. So CRP levels within our bodies are indicative of the amount of systemic inflammation that we have. And they've found that throughout our cycles, those CRP levels actually fluctuate, which again, as they should, because the menstrual cycle is that primary example of inflammation within our bodies. But they have found that those levels do fluctuate throughout our bodies. And so CRP levels are highest during our period, so during menstruation, which, so as we covered, like we expect that, right? That's when a lot of things are happening in order to clear that lining and shed that lining during our periods. They're the lowest during the follicular phase, which again, that's when that estrogen is rising. That's when we have more of those anti-inflammatory properties and more of that shift towards anti-inflammation within our bodies. And then they increase again during the luteal phase, which again, that's kind of what we expect, also based on how we feel within our bodies. So this is, again, we don't have to do the blood marker, but it was pointed out in one of the studies that they did that it is important, if you do get this level tested as a woman, to know what phase of your cycle you're in, because it does matter, and you don't want any sort of like false readings from that given the phase that you're in your cycle. So those friendly prostaglandins and those cytokines and enzyme activity also play a role systemically. So they are released locally, but they can enter the bloodstream and affect us systemically. So those prostaglandins, again, are associated with creating that hypoxic environment, creating those muscle contractions in order to help shed. And so they can also create that same thing in other parts of our body. So specifically our digestive tracts. I don't know if any of you guys have digestive issues when you're on your periods, but I know I do, and these guys can be a contributor to that. Although small, but it can be a contributor. Okay, and then we'll end on a good one. But the rising estrogen in the follicular phase can lead to decreased inflammation throughout the body, which again, we sort of know this intuitively if we track our cycles, but we feel the best during this phase. Our workouts usually feel the best, our bodies feel the best, our minds feel the best, and that is associated with that overall decrease in estrogen and that shift towards anti-inflammation within the whole body. So I hope you guys enjoyed this little overview of how the menstrual cycle relates to the inflammatory process. I think it's pretty cool that we have such an applicable way to demonstrate inflammation month to month, and something that we can hopefully give ourselves a little bit more grace for and understand what's happening within our bodies. Because I do feel like the more that I learn about cortisol and inflammation and our menstrual cycle, and the more I dive into the research, the better I'm able to understand my body and really learn my body and listen to my body better, rather than just going off of some arbitrary markers. I can now understand that, oh, the reason I'm cramping is because I am releasing those prostaglandins, which are good. Because I am bloated and fatigued, I know that my body is working in the way that it should. And there are ways that we can help that, which again, we cover some of the pelvic floor cramping and the bloating mobility flows. Like, there are things that we can do to help with some of those symptoms. Exercise, opening up the pelvic floor, breath work, tuning into that parasympathetic nervous system, like helping our bodies. We can do some behaviors that can help the foods that we eat, shifting our focus towards anti-inflammatory foods in one phase or increased omega-3s and vitamin C in another phase. Like there's so many things we can do, and we'll cover all of that in the menstrual cycle program, but it still allows us to be more educated on that cycle. And again, yeah, just to just know our bodies a little bit better and to give ourselves grace whenever we are feeling, just kind of blah throughout the cycle, knowing what's happening within our bodies. So inflammation, again, is necessary in order for us to help regulate the cycle, which again is considered that fifth vital sign. It's very important for us women to have this sort of regularity within our cycle. And if it's ever out of regularity, that's when we have a clue and an indicator as to something that is off within our body. And it's about trying to figure out that root cause to it, right? So the menstrual cycle, inflammation, they go hand in hand. So I hope you guys learned something from this episode. I hope it has helped to decrease the fear surrounding inflammation, realizing how inflammation is so beneficial and so helpful for our menstrual cycles. And again, next week we will cover systemic inflammation throughout the whole body and how the inflammatory process can affect us from a just full body perspective, from a lot of different systems, our cardiovascular, our digestive, our muscular, all of it. So I hope you enjoyed this episode on the menstrual cycle and inflammation, and I hope you learned something that you can apply immediately today. If you like this episode and think that you have a friend or family member that would benefit from it, I would appreciate it if you shared it with them. If you commented, liked, subscribed, reviewed, whatever, on whatever channel you're listening to this on. It really, really helps. Again, I'm super, super grateful. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode and for this Debunking Inflammation series. Stay tuned for next week, and I'll see you guys again on the next episode.